Origins of the Potter name. The name Potter comes from the Old English word potar, meaning maker of pots. At first glance, it's as muggle as it gets, but during the early centuries of wizardkind, when magical folk still lived side by side with muggles, many wizards took on simple occupational surnames to blend in. Having a modest name was a way to stay hidden in plain sight. So while the Malfoys were busy polishing their family crests, the Potters quietly lived under the radar, carrying a name that disguised their magical heritage. It also reflects something deeper about the family itself. There's humility baked into that name. Potter doesn't scream power or status. It suggests craftsmanship, creativity, and patience. And if you trace the family back to its earliest known ancestor, you'll find that spirit of quiet innovation runs through their bloodline like magic itself. Linfred of Stinchcomb. That story begins with Linfred of Stinchcomb, a name most wizards today probably wouldn't recognize, but one that deserves to be spoken with the same reverence as Dumbledore or Merlin. Linfred lived in the 12th century in a small village in Gloucestershire. To the muggles around him, he was just a kindly, absent-minded man who always had something bubbling away in his garden shed. They called him the Potterer because he was constantly pottering about, as they put it, with plants, ingredients, and strange little experiments. But Linfred wasn't just a hobbyist. He was a healer and a genius far ahead of his time. The potions he brewed to help his neighbours weren't herbal remedies, they were magical innovations. His concoctions cured fevers, healed wounds, and soothed pains that Muggle medicine couldn't even begin to understand. In secret, he was developing the earliest versions of some of the wizarding world's most famous potions. Skelegro, the potion that regrows bones, traces its roots to Linfred's work. So does Pepper-Up Potion, which banishes the common cold with a puff of steam from your ears. He was a man of pure curiosity, the kind who didn't chase power or recognition, only discovery. And because of that, Linfred's kindness and intelligence became the foundation of the Potter legacy. His magical inventions made his family wealthy, but more importantly, they gave the Potters something far greater than gold, a reputation for decency and brilliance. When Linfred passed, he left behind 7 children and a considerable fortune. But his greatest legacy was something intangible, the spirit of invention and humility that would define his descendants for centuries to come. Cloak of Invisibility. Now, here's where the story turns from impressive to downright legendary. Centuries after Linfred's time, the Potter family's destiny became intertwined with one of the most powerful magical artifacts ever created, the Cloak of Invisibility. The cloak story begins long before the Potters ever possessed it. According to the tales of Beadle the Bard, it belonged to Ignotus Peverell, the youngest of the 3 brothers who encountered death himself. And while his brothers chose gifts of power like the Resurrection Stone and the Elder Wand, Ignotus chose wisdom. He asked for something that would let him live freely, hidden from death's gaze. And so death gave him his own cloak, woven with magic so pure it could hide its wearer completely, even from other invisibility spells. Generations later, the Peverell bloodline blended with that of the Potters when Linfred's descendant, Hardwin Potter, married Iolanthe Peverell, Ignotus's granddaughter. Through that union, the fabled cloak passed into the Potter family's care, where it was treated not as a weapon or a trophy, but as a sacred heirloom. And here's the remarkable thing. While other invisibility cloaks eventually fade or lose their enchantment, this one never did. It was true magic, not a charm, not a trick of light, but a relic born from death's own gift. Over the centuries, it was handed down from parent to child, always to the eldest of each generation, until it finally reached James Potter, and later Harry. When Harry used it at Hogwarts, he wasn't just sneaking into the restricted section, he was carrying a piece of his family's history, a direct link to the 12th century wizard who once outwitted death itself. That single piece of cloth had witnessed centuries of wizarding history, quietly passed down through one of the most honourable families in the magical world. From Linfred's sheds to Ignotus's legend, their story has always been one of kindness wrapped in quiet power. Potter family history. As the years passed after Linfred and Hardwin, the Potter family never became the loudest or most politically active name in wizarding society, and that was exactly their strength. While other ancient families spent decades locked in ministry rivalries or trying to influence magical law, the Potters remained independent. They didn't chase seats on the Wizengamot, and they rarely involved themselves in public drama, which gave them something incredibly rare in the wizarding world: respect without fear. The Potters lived mostly in the West Country, quiet, isolated properties protected by subtle enchantments rather than the dramatic wards used by families like the Blacks. Their homes weren't monuments to wealth. They were places of warmth, with gardens full of magical plants, potion sheds still echoing the spirit of Linfred's experiments, and libraries filled with journals passed down through generations. By the late 1800s, the family had developed a reputation with certain circles of healers and potioneers. Though they weren't famous to the general public, anyone deeply invested in magical herbology or healing knew the Potters had roots in early potion craft. Healers from St. Mungo's even referenced Linfred's work in old training texts, though his name had long faded into obscurity. Ironically, the Muggles remembered him better than wizards did, still speaking of the mysterious but kind potterer who once lived near Stinchcomb. Then came Fleamont Potter. Unlike some of his quieter ancestors, Fleamont had a certain flair. He refined Sleek Easy's hair potion, a product that became a household name thanks to its effectiveness in taming even the most unlikely witch or wizard hair. Fun fact, this is the same potion Hermione Granger used during the Yule Ball. Fleamont didn't just sell a potion, he built a brand, and for the first time the Potter name became associated with commerce and innovation on a large scale. Still, despite their wealth, Fleamont and his wife Euphemia kept a simple life. They only had one child late in life, James Potter, and they dedicated everything to raising him with the same values the family had quietly upheld for centuries. Intelligence without arrogance, courage without cruelty, magic without elitism. When Fleamont and Euphemia died, both from dragonpox not long before Harry was born, many in the wizarding world didn't realise an era had ended. With their passing, James became the last of a very old line, a line that was about to be forever changed by war, prophecy, and fate. Blood status debate. In the early days of magical Britain, blood status wasn't the obsession it would later become. Magic ran unpredictably through families, appearing in one generation and then skipping the next. Some magical children were born to non-magical parents without warning, and for centuries that was simply seen as part of wizarding life. But over time, fear crept in. Fear of exposure, fear of persecution from Muggles, and fear of losing magic altogether. As a result, some wizarding families began tracking lineage obsessively, pruning their family trees like gardeners removing branches they considered impure. That's when the terms pureblood, half-blood, and Muggle-born began to hold more weight than they ever should have. The Potters, however, never gave in to that fear. They knew their history. They knew their magic ran deep, but they also understood that magic wasn't a pedigree. It was a gift. So while families like the Lestranges, the Axleys, and Malfoys created unwritten laws about who was worthy, the Potters remained quietly defiant by doing something radical, treating everyone the same. When James Potter married Lily Evans, it wasn't just a love story. It was a powerful political statement without ever trying to be one. A pureblood wizard marrying a Muggle-born witch wasn't unheard of, but during Voldemort's rise, it was nearly an act of rebellion. Death Eaters sneered at James for tainting an ancient bloodline, but the Potter family never hesitated. They welcomed Lily as one of their own. And that's why the Potters became symbols of hope in the First Wizarding War, not because they were warriors or politicians, but because they represented a version of wizarding society where blood didn't define destiny. Pureblood versus half-blood. The magical world likes to pretend blood status is a simple classification, but it's really a mirror. It reflects how people choose to view others. Voldemort himself, born Tom Marvolo Riddle, was technically a half-blood, yet he built an entire movement around pureblood superiority to hide his own shame and insecurity. That irony sits at the very heart of wizarding conflict. Harry's existence directly challenges the ideology Voldemort stood for. On paper, Harry is a half-blood, the son of a pureblood father and a Muggle-born mother, but in reality, his ancestral magic runs older and deeper than many families who claim superiority. Through the Potters, he carries the legacy of Linfred the Healer. Through the Peverells, he carries the blood of the brother who outsmarted death. And that's the ultimate contradiction. The same people who called Harry Tainted were unknowingly speaking about one of the last living descendants of a legendary magical bloodline that shaped wizarding history. Blood purity then becomes a hollow construct. The Potters proved that magic isn't strengthened by isolation. It thrives on choice, connection, and compassion. James's marriage to Lily didn't weaken their bloodline, it completed it. In a way, Harry was the perfect culmination of wizarding heritage and muggle-born brilliance, and that union is exactly what Voldemort feared most. Magical bloodlines. When wizards talk about magical bloodlines, they're not just talking about ancestry. They're talking about legacy, about how magic weaves itself through generations, shaping families in quiet, powerful ways. Some bloodlines become obsessed with power, like the Gaunts, who clung so tightly to their connection to Salazar Slytherin that they inbred themselves into madness. Others become symbols of status, like the Malfoys, who built their identity around wealth and influence. But then there are families like the Potters, whose magic is rooted in something much more enduring: purpose. The Potter bloodline is a rare blend of two types of magical heritage: scholarly magic and legacy magic. Through Linfred, they inherited a line of inventors and healers, witches and wizards who improved lives rather than dominating them. Their magic wasn't loud, it was subtle, intelligent, engineered with intention. Through the Peverills, they inherited something older, more mystical, a connection to one of the great magical artifacts of wizarding history, a literal Deathly Hallow. This combination created a family line that didn't just possess magic, they understood it. Most wizarding families treat heirlooms as trophies. The Blacks displayed artifacts like symbols of dominance. The Gaunts hoarded the Resurrection Stone as proof of their lineage. But the Potters treated the invisibility cloak differently. They passed it down not as a symbol of superiority, but as a responsibility. Each generation of Potters understood one thing: magic is not meant to be showcased. It's meant to be used wisely. And that's what sets their bloodline apart. The Potter lineage is proof that magical heritage doesn't have to lead to corruption or arrogance. It can produce healers instead of tyrants, innovators instead of dark lords. It's poetic that the boy born from this line, the last Potter, would grow up to stand against a wizard who believed blood determined greatness. Tainted blood concept. The phrase tainted blood is one of the most poisonous ideas to ever infect the wizarding world. It was never an official term in magical lore. It was something worse, a whisper, a cultural stain passed around in pureblood drawing rooms, spoken quietly at dinner tables, ingrained into children before they could even hold a wand. Families like the Blacks and Yaxleys raised their children to believe that Muggleborns and half-bloods diluted magic, that associating with them somehow cheapened wizard kind. They saw love outside pureblood circles as contamination. But history proved them wrong over and over again. Voldemort, the darkest wizard of the modern age, was a half-blood himself. Meanwhile, some of the greatest magical minds, like Hermione Granger, came from non-magical parents entirely. So where does that leave the concept of tainted blood? Exposed, stripped of its false elegance, revealed for what it truly is: fear masquerading as tradition. The Potters never entertained that belief. Their family history shows no signs of marrying for purity, no desperate attempts to preserve some imagined perfection in their lineage. They didn't see blood as something to protect, they saw it as something to share. And that is what makes their legacy untouched by corruption. In a world obsessed with purity, the Potters quietly stood for something far more powerful: integrity. When Harry, the descendant of both ancient lineage and Muggle-born resilience, stood in front of Voldemort during that final battle, it wasn't just good versus evil. It was heritage versus ideology. The last heir of a bloodline built on compassion standing against a man who built an army around hatred. And in that moment, everything became clear. Blood alone means nothing. Legacy is defined by the choices made, not the ancestry claimed.